Hi, students. It's Dr. Rebecca Barrett-Fox here, your instructor for Introduction to Sociology. And in this module, we're going to talk about inequality and poverty, one of the core concepts of Introduction to Sociology. And just so important if you're going to use sociology professionally. Many of us who use sociology professionally are social workers, criminologists, parole officers, um, people in or probation officers and other people who work in the court system. And inequality and poverty have so much to do with those topics. Also nursing and medicine. So this is a really essential concept for introduction to, or for sociology students. It's also something that you might have some very personal experience with. And so as we're working through this module, if you, I want you to pay attention to your own experiences and your own response to what we're learning. For some of you, it might feel frustrating that this might feel new to other people because it might feel very familiar to you. Occasionally, you might be learning new words to describe experiences that you couldn't recognize before. Or more likely, if you have experienced poverty, you know what the experience feels like, but and so you're familiar with the experience, but you haven't maybe been able to put sociological concepts behind it yet or apply those concepts to it. So I encourage you to be patient with yourself and be curious about the experiences of other people as we work through this module. I'm going to start out with a hard question. What is life worth? I mean this literally. How much is a life worth? How would you answer that question? You might answer it by figuring out the value on the black market of various human organs. You might figure it out by figuring out the value of a person if they were sold into some kind of slavery. Um, think to yourself, how else could you define or answer this question? And how do we decide what a life is worth? Well, if it sounds a little abstract or a little morose, it's a question that actually we answer all the time. We answer it in insurance cases. We answer it in tort action in courts when people sue each other. One person's actions have caused another person's death. How do we know how much the victim's family should be compensated for? So it's actually a question we have some math behind. We answered it in a very large way after the attacks in Washington, D.C., New York City, and Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania on September 11th, 2001. This is a photo collage of the nearly 3,000 people who were killed that day in terrorist attacks in the U.S. In addition to the mass grief and sadness and fear that this incident caused, it also caused us to ask a hard question. How do we determine what these lives were worth? Because each of these people had a life that was worth something, and most of them had people who depended on them, dependents. So a spouse, children, minor children who would have been dependent on them for their income, maybe adult children with a disability, maybe they were a caretaker for an aging parent. How do we determine what the victims' families, who are themselves a kind of victim of September 11th, deserved? Right? There's no amount of money that you can be paid that brings back a lost loved one. And when they've died in such a tremendously horrific way, there's no amount of money that can soothe that. So what do we owe them? Now we recognize here we're not talking about the US government taking responsibility for these deaths. Though there's some underlying concern about that. I'm talking about a conspiracy theory. But I'm talking about the fact that there was concern that these families would sue the government or the airline industries, airline industry. So either individual airlines, like industry as a whole, or the government agencies that oversee these industries for failure to prevent this attack. So there was a very practical reason to offer compensation to the dependents and the victims, the families of people who died. And that is to keep our airlines going. Because if they had been sued, maybe for what a court would have determined they deserved to be sued for, our transportation system, we think, or at least was argued, couldn't sustain that. It would be too risky then to operate flights, which has a lot to do with commerce and not just, taking your family on a trip, but international business. There's a big capitalistic investment in air travel. And so the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund was set up, and it was charged with a pro bono administrator, a lawyer who had some really excellent experience, worked on Agent Orange cases, on people who, soldiers, Korean War soldiers who had been harmed by Agent Orange, which is um, a deforestation chemical used during that war. And he set up the guidelines to determine how do we pay out. And in making that decision, how do we pay out? He used the same kind of logic that we use for other kinds of tort cases that insurance uses. Like I said, when people are sue each other in court for wrongful death, and there's compensation. And that principle is we look at what is a reasonable, predictable lifetime earning of the person who is dead. And we put that into a formula to determine how much their victims should get. So this means that the people who worked in the cafeteria, worked in the janitorial staff, the flight attendants, people who are at the low income levels in the Pentagon and the World Trade Center building, and on the flight that went down in Pennsylvania, those people's families received less money. Right. So again, the court looked and said, not the court, this fund reviewed what we could have expected these people to earn over the lifetime and used that as the basis for how much money would be awarded. Right. So, and again, this is exactly what would happen if you were killed in a car accident, and your family sued the other driver. The court would say, what would we have expected them to, how much economic productivity, how much money would they be earning over a lifetime? So the people at the top, right? The businessman flying first class, the people with the penthouse suites, the high-ranking military officials, the people who have a higher income, their families would have received more money from the fund. So the principles driving this is there would be proportional compensation of victims based on estimated loss of future earnings. That is a kind of clinical legalese way of saying we're going to estimate how much would they have earned. So that's based on how much of your life is left ahead of you. So old people would have been, their families would have received less than young people. And their job earnings now would have been seen as determining what their future job earnings were. Now, a lot of people got upset about this. And if you're feeling something that says, hey, wait a second, I don't like that, hold on to that feeling. There was a restraint here, something that didn't let this get too out of control. And that there was a rule of thumb that 85% of the money, no more than 85% of the money would go the 15 richest claimants. So the 15 richest families of the deceased, 15%, the top 15%, they couldn't take more than 85% of the total fund. Some of them were very upset about this because they said, hey, it's supposed to be proportional to my earnings. My dad was a billionaire, and so we should get all the money. And that would be what's most fair. Other people said no, what's unfair is the assumption that um, it, this whole system is unfair. First, it relies on the assumption that whatever people are earning now is what they'll earn for the rest of their lives. So it is kind of a recognition that there's not a lot of class mobility in the US. So that people who start at the bottom tend to stay at the bottom, much more than we kind of, in our American myth of ourselves, our ideology about who we think we are. Um, it is the case. And then other people said this is just entirely unfair because um, the value of your future earnings, estimated loss from future earnings, doesn't determine what your family needs, right? So if a janitor was not going to make that much over his lifetime, but he leaves behind 6 children, those 6 children need to be cared for. And they actually need more care than the man who is a billionaire and whose family will be fine, whether he gets any money at all from this victim compensation fund or not. But this really laid bare um, the way that we value people's lives, which is that in America, we literally value the lives of rich people more than the lives of poor people. And again, this protected the airline industry from lawsuits. And so we recognize that even though in the end, I think most people would feel like the victims were well cared for. Not all victims agreed to participate in this fund, and there was a handful of ones who refused to give up their right to sue the airline. And just one family, though, went to trial with the airlines. As they said, they weren't interested in the money. They were interested in holding the airlines responsible for not protecting people from terrorism. But this is very protective of the airline industry, and that really means it's protective of capitalism and protective of the status quo. Um, it would be a reasonable argument in court to say that the airlines should have been more cautious and should have had more restrictions in place to prevent something like this. But we used public funds instead to both care for the victims, but again, wick away energy from the possibility of lawsuits. So how does that make you feel? Um, if if I had said it before I gave you this example, that in America we value the lives of the rich more than the lives of the poor, you might have thought, oh, Dr. Barrett-Fox is exaggerating. Dr. Barrett-Fox is being emotional. And I'm saying, no, Dr. Barrett-Fox is showing the facts and the math of how this works. This is literally how we decide the value of a life. So what the lesson is, in America, your life is worth what we can reasonably expect your job to pay you over the years we can reasonably expect you to work it. Right? You can imagine all kinds of other ways to determine the value of a person's life. Where does this leave a homemaker, for example? Where does this leave a person who, because of disability, can't be employed and earn income? Where does this leave someone who chooses to take a low-income job in order to do other kinds of community activities? Maybe they provide care for their community. Maybe they provide leadership in some kind of other way. We don't value that at all. Like literally, we're not valuing it. Here, the lesson here is that your value is based on your economic productivity. And again, I hope that doesn't settle too well with you. Even if that's how you want your life to be measured, I hope it doesn't settle. It doesn't. I hope it doesn't. I hope you're disturbed that that's how we would demand that other people's lives be measured as well. That was part of an early 2000s focus of our public attention on American inequality. We became much more aware for many people of the great inequality happening across the US. And in part, that's because we've had inequality for a long time, but in the early 2000s, there was a lot of banking regulation changes and compensation changes for corporate leaders like CEOs that really sent inequality skyrocketing. This is a map of a global map. The darker the color blue, the higher the inequality in a nation. This is called the Gini Index, and it's just a measure of economic inequality in a population here by nation. The US has more inequality in the US than the global average, right? So when you take all the countries and you look at them, we have more than average, and we have more than any of our peer nations. Our peer nations are ones with advanced economies, high technical levels, high degrees of democracy, and usually advanced militaries come with that. So Australia, Japan, um, European nations, or at least Eastern European nations, Canada, we consider our peer nations. And compared to them, we have much higher inequality. A lot more poor people. Of course, we have a large population. So in raw numbers, a lot more poor people, but also a much larger gap between the poor and the rich. When I say inequality, equality, those might be terms you think about in terms of politics. If you studied rhetoric, these are words we hear in a lot of speeches, like famous speeches, by abolitionists and civil rights leaders um, and suffragettes who are arguing for the women's right to vote. Equality sounds like it's a really great word. And I want us to be a little bit critical about that, because equality is illustrated in this image, this graphic from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, is the idea that everybody gets the same. And that is oftentimes, especially when we're young, that's what feels fair, right? So everybody gets the same, right? Um, the reason that that's not sufficient in creating a fair world or a just world is because not everybody needs the same. Right? So in our illustration here, we have three people who are all given the same bike, and it works for our middle rider. Right? Our middle rider, if the bike is the right size, the road is the right road. But look up top, we've got a child on a bumpy road, and a road bike isn't sufficient for that. It's not going to work. And this bike is way too big. And on our bottom row, we have a woman who uses a wheelchair. For whom a bike isn't helpful at all. And also look at this. She's on an incline. Um, so the terrain is different, and she is different. A free bike given to everybody doesn't help everybody, even though it feels equal. Now, if you grew up in a family with siblings, you probably learned this at some point, and it might have been a painful lesson, that your parents could love you equally, but they couldn't treat you equally because you had different needs. Right? And part of the advantage of having a family or having siblings in your family is that you get to learn that. We look on the right, on our blue image here, we see what equity looks like. Equity means that everyone gets what they need to have a fair shot. So equality, everybody gets the same thing, with the implication or the assumption that that same thing will give them an equal opportunity. But it doesn't. They don't get an equal opportunity until they actually have a fair playing field, a level playing field. Or in other words, they all have what they need to get to the same end. Right. So here our middle row has the same bike. It still suits him, fits him fine, is appropriate for the conditions. So there's a good fit between the tool he's been given, the terrain, the situation he faces, and the skills he's bringing to the situation. On top, now we have the child has a bike with knobby wheels, right? A dirt bike, which is better for the bumpy terrain. And it's sized appropriately now. Now this child has the same shot as this person to getting where he needs to go, right? Same shot, because he's got the right tools for the situation and for his ability level. And in our bottom row, we have a woman who doesn't have a bike at all, because that's not going to be helpful to her as a wheelchair user. She has instead a motorized wheelchair, which is going to work on an inclined plane and assists her, since she's a person who has a limb loss here. Right? We've got some missing bottom half calves and feet. So her disability is now accommodated. So not everybody needs the same thing, right? At the start, on the left hand, if we had given everybody a little mountain bike for a child, that wouldn't have been helpful. And if we'd given everybody a motorized wheelchair, that wouldn't have been helpful either. Now, equity is a little bit of a politicized term in our present moment. And so you may have heard this used in negative ways, that it's a way of assuring the same outcomes. If the outcome is that we want everybody to have a good and healthy life, I think, a good outcome to aim for. But equity is actually about making sure that everybody has what they need to navigate the situation that they have, the reality that they face, with the skills that they bring. And some people are going to need more, and some people are going to need less. And sometimes people just need different things. Well, this is just a taste of what you're going to learn in this module. You're going to ask yourself some hard questions. You're going to learn some hard things. And I encourage you to keep an open mind, be curious, pay attention to your own responses as you think about these questions. One, what is inequality? And why is America so unequal? We're going to ask the question, do we all have equal opportunity to have an equal opportunity to succeed in life? And guess what? The answer is no, we don't. You probably know that, because when you think about what you would want for people of the future, like if you decide that you're going to have children, or you do have children, I don't make the assumption that's everybody's goal, but imagine that you did. You would want them to start in a place where the rest of life is easier, not the rest of life is harder. And we'll ask the question, how much poverty exists in the US and around the world? So some objective measures of poverty, and also we'll learn a little bit about how poverty is measured. That is it for our introductory video. If you have questions about this or anything else in the module, please let me know.